In courtrooms across America, judges see countless faces, some guilty, some innocent, all carrying stories that rarely get told in full. But sometimes, just sometimes, a case comes along that reminds everyone present why we should never judge a book by its cover. Sometimes the person standing before the bench looking defeated and forgotten by society carries secrets that could change everything. Sometimes the homeless woman in torn clothes has served her country in ways most people never could. Sometimes the most unlikely hero walks into a courtroom and teaches everyone present about honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. The morning fog hung heavy over downtown Seattle as Judge Margaret Chen prepared for another routine day in municipal court. She had been presiding over cases in this courtroom for nearly 15 years, and in that time she had seen it all. Drug possession cases, petty theft, trespassing violations, public intoxication charges, the endless cycle of human struggle that seemed to repeat itself with different faces but similar circumstances. Today's docket looked no different from any other Tuesday morning in October. Sarah Martinez sat in the holding area, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. At 42 years old, she looked older, worn down by months of living on the streets. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, hung limply around her shoulders. The orange jumpsuit she wore was too big for her slight frame, making her appear even smaller and more vulnerable than she already felt. Dark circles under her brown eyes told the story of countless sleepless nights spent in doorways, under bridges, or in homeless shelters when she was lucky enough to find space. The charges against Sarah were relatively minor. Criminal trespass and theft of food items totaling less than $30. She had been caught sleeping in the storage room of a small grocery store and had taken some bread, peanut butter, and bottled water. The store owner, Mr. David Colon Kim, was a kind man who might have let it slide, but his insurance company insisted on pressing charges to prevent setting a precedent that might encourage other desperate people to break into his establishment. Public defender Lisa Rodriguez shuffled through the paperwork for her morning cases. Sarah's file was thin, just a few pages documenting the arrest, the charges, and a brief background check that revealed no significant criminal history. What the file didn't reveal was the extraordinary story of service, sacrifice, and circumstances that had led Sarah to this moment. Lisa had barely had 5 minutes to speak with her client before court began, just enough time to confirm basic details and explain the charges. Your Honor, calling case number 2023. CR 4751 State versus Sarah Elena Martinez, announced the bailiff, Deputy Johnson, a veteran court officer who had seen thousands of defendants pass through these doors. As he called the name, he glanced at the defendant list, noting the charges were for trespass and petty theft, nothing unusual for a Tuesday morning. Sarah rose slowly from the wooden bench in the holding area. Her legs felt unsteady, partly from hunger and partly from the overwhelming anxiety of facing a judge. She had never been in serious legal trouble before, and the entire process felt foreign and intimidating. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom seemed harsh and unforgiving as she walked toward the defendant's table, her court-issued shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. Judge Chen looked up from her paperwork as the defendant approached. What she saw was a woman who appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s, thin and clearly malnourished, with the weathered appearance of someone who had been living rough for an extended period. The judge had presided over hundreds of similar cases, people driven to petty crime by desperation, addiction, or mental illness. It was one of the more heartbreaking aspects of her job, seeing human beings at their lowest points, often trapped in cycles they seemed unable to break. Martinez, Judge Chen said in her measured, professional tone, "You are charged with criminal trespass in the 2nd degree and theft in the 3rd degree. These charges stem from an incident on October 15th at Kim's Corner Market on Pine Street. Do you understand the charges against you?" Sarah nodded, her voice barely audible as she responded, "Yes, Your Honor." She stood as straight as she could manage, despite the fatigue and stress that seemed to weigh down every part of her body. There was something in her posture, even in her current state, that suggested discipline and training, though it would take a keen observer to notice it beneath the layers of hardship and defeat. Lisa Rodriguez stood beside her client, noting the way Sarah held herself despite her circumstances. As a public defender, Lisa had developed an instinct for reading people quickly, and something about Sarah Martinez intrigued her. There was a quality to her bearing that seemed inconsistent with someone who had made a career of petty crime or had struggled with long-term addiction. But with dozens of cases on her docket and only minutes to prepare for each one, Lisa didn't have the luxury of digging deeper into her client's background. "How do you plead to these charges, Ms. Martinez?" Judge Chen continued, following the standard protocol that had become second nature after years on the bench. "Guilty, Your Honor?" Sarah replied, her voice still quiet but clear. She knew she had taken the food, knew she had been trespassing, and saw no point in denying facts that were clearly documented. In her mind, this was simply another consequence of the impossible situation she found herself in, another step in a downward spiral that had begun nearly 2 years earlier when a series of devastating events had turned her life upside down. Judge Chen made notes on her paperwork, preparing to move through the standard sentencing guidelines for such minor offenses. Typically, for a first-time offender facing these particular charges, she would impose a fine, community service, and possibly a short period of probation. The goal was to address the underlying issues that led to the crime while avoiding unnecessarily harsh punishment that might make it even more difficult for the defendant to get back on their feet. But as Judge Chen looked up at Sarah Martinez, something made her pause. Perhaps it was the way the defendant stood at attention despite her obvious distress. Or maybe it was an indefinable quality in her demeanor that suggested this woman's story might be more complex than the simple facts of the case indicated. Judge Chen had learned to trust these instincts over her years on the bench, and something was telling her to take a closer look at this case. "Ms. Martinez," the judge said, deviating from her usual routine. "Before we proceed with sentencing, I'd like to understand a bit more about your circumstances. How long have you been homeless?" Sarah looked up, surprised by the question. Most court proceedings she had witnessed during her time in the system moved quickly, with little attention paid to individual circumstances beyond what was directly relevant to the charges. "About 8 months, Your Honor," she answered honestly. "And what led to your current situation?" Judge Chen asked, ignoring the slight impatience she sensed from the prosecutor, who was clearly eager to move through the morning's cases efficiently. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how much detail to provide, or whether the judge genuinely wanted to hear her story, or was simply following a procedural checklist. "I lost my job in my apartment," she said simply, not wanting to burden the court with the full complexity of what had happened to her life. Judge Chen sensed there was much more to the story. "What kind of work did you do before you became homeless?" Again, Sarah hesitated. The truth was complicated, and she had found that people often reacted with disbelief when she told them about her background. The gap between who she had been and who she appeared to be now seemed too vast for most people to bridge in their minds. "I worked in security," she said finally, choosing a simple answer that was technically accurate but far from complete. Lisa Rodriguez glanced at her client with new interest. Something in Sarah's tone and the careful way she had chosen her words suggested there might be more to explore in her background. As a defense attorney, Lisa had learned to listen for the subtle cues that indicated when a client might have a story that could be relevant to their case or their sentencing. "What kind of security work?" Judge Chen pressed, her curiosity now clearly engaged. Sarah looked down at her hands, then back up at the judge. She had spent months trying to forget who she used to be, trying to accept that the person she had been before was gone forever, lost along with everything else she had once valued about her life. But standing in this courtroom being asked directly about her past, she found herself unable to continue hiding from the truth. "I was in the military, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Which branch?" Judge Chen asked, her tone becoming more engaged. "Navy," Sarah replied, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she stood a little straighter, as if the mere mention of her service had awakened something in her muscle memory. "How long did you serve?" 12 years, Your Honor." Judge Chen set down her pen and looked more carefully at the woman standing before her. 12 years of military service suggested a level of dedication and capability that seemed at odds with the simple theft and trespass charges. "What was your specialty in the Navy?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been dreading, the point where her past and present would collide in a way that always seemed to create more questions than answers. People either didn't believe her or couldn't understand how someone with her background had ended up in her current situation. Both reactions were painful in their own ways. "I was a Navy SEAL, Your Honor," The courtroom fell silent. Deputy Johnson looked up from his paperwork with raised eyebrows. The prosecutor, who had been checking his watch and thinking about his next case, suddenly focused his full attention on the defendant. Lisa Rodriguez felt her breath catch in her throat as she turned to stare at her client with new eyes. Judge Chen sat back in her chair, studying Sarah Martinez with a completely different perspective. Navy SEALs represented the absolute elite of military special operations forces. The training was legendary for its difficulty, with success rates that eliminated all but the most exceptional candidates. The idea that someone with that level of training, discipline, and capability could end up homeless and desperate enough to steal food challenged everything the judge thought she understood about military veterans and their transition to civilian life. "You were a Navy SEAL," Judge Chen repeated, not as a question, but as a statement she was trying to process. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah confirmed. And now she did stand fully at attention, her shoulders back and her chin up, displaying for the first time since entering the courtroom the bearing and presence that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. The transformation was remarkable. The defeated, weathered woman who had shuffled to the defendant's table just minutes earlier had been replaced by someone whose very posture communicated competence, training, and strength. It was as if acknowledging her past had awakened something in Sarah that had been dormant, buried under months of despair and survival mode. Judge Chen realized that everything about this case had just changed. The standard sentencing guidelines that she had been mentally reviewing suddenly seemed completely inadequate for someone with Sarah Martinez's background. This wasn't just another homeless person who had stolen food out of desperation. This was a decorated veteran who had served her country in one of the most demanding and dangerous roles possible, and something had gone catastrophically wrong in her transition to civilian life. "Ms. Rodriguez," Judge Chen said, addressing the public defender, "I think we need to take a deeper look at this case. I'm going to postpone sentencing until we can get a more complete picture of Miss Pope, Martinez's circumstances and service record." Lisa Rodriguez nodded eagerly, her mind already racing with new possibilities for her client's case. If Sarah Martinez was indeed a former Navy SEAL, there might be resources available for veterans, mental health services, housing assistance, and job training programs that could address the underlying issues that had led to her current situation. The prosecutor, David Warner, found himself in an unexpected position. He had been prepared for a quick guilty plea and standard sentencing for a minor theft case. Now he was facing a defendant whose service record might completely change how the case should be approached. "Your Honor, the state would be amenable to exploring alternative sentencing options given the defendant's military service," he said, recognizing that prosecuting a Navy SEAL for stealing $30 worth of food was not the kind of case that would reflect well on anyone involved. Sarah Martinez stood at the defendant's table, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since her first days of SEAL training. She had revealed the secret she had been carrying for months, the identity she had tried to leave behind when everything else in her life had fallen apart. Now she would have to face the questions, the disbelief, and the inevitable inquiries into how someone like her could have ended up in such circumstances. Judge Chen looked at the clock on the courtroom wall and realized that this case was going to require much more time and attention than she had originally anticipated. "We're going to need to continue this hearing," she announced. "I want to see Miss Martinez's complete military service record, including her discharge papers and any medical records related to her service. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm also ordering a comprehensive background investigation and evaluation to determine what resources might be available to help your client." As the bailiff prepared to escort Sarah back to the holding area, Judge Chen addressed her directly. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to understand that your service to this country matters, and we're going to make sure you get the help you deserve. This court recognizes that whatever circumstances led to these charges, they don't define who you are or diminish what you've contributed to your country." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes for the first time in months. Since becoming homeless, she had grown accustomed to being invisible, to being dismissed and ignored by a society that seemed to have no place for people in her situation. To hear a judge acknowledge her service and express genuine concern for her welfare was overwhelming. "Thank you, Your Honor," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. As Sarah was escorted from the courtroom, Judge Chen sat quietly for a moment, processing what had just occurred. In all her years on the bench, she had never encountered a case quite like this one. She had presided over numerous cases involving homeless defendants, and she had handled cases involving veterans struggling with various issues, but she had never seen someone who represented such an extreme contrast between past achievement and present circumstances. The judge made a note to herself to research Navy SEAL training and service requirements. She wanted to understand exactly what kind of person Sarah Martinez had been before her life had taken such a dramatic turn. She also planned to reach out to veteran services organizations to better understand what resources might be available and what might have contributed to Sarah's current situation. Lisa Rodriguez gathered her files, her mind already working on how to approach her client's case with this new information. She would need to verify Sarah's military service, understand what had led to her discharge, and investigate what support systems had failed to prevent her slide into homelessness. This case had the potential to become something much more significant than a simple theft prosecution. It could become an opportunity to address the broader issues facing military veterans in their transition to civilian life. The prosecutor, David Warner, also found himself reconsidering the case from a completely different angle. His office had policies regarding veteran defendants, and Sarah Martinez's background would certainly qualify her for various diversion programs and alternative sentencing options. He made a mental note to research what services were available and to prepare recommendations that would focus on rehabilitation and support rather than punishment. As the courtroom cleared and Judge Chen prepared for her next case, she couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Martinez. The image of the transformation she had witnessed, from a defeated homeless woman to a proud Navy SEAL, would stay with her for a long time. It served as a powerful reminder of the complex stories that every defendant brought into her courtroom and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to understand the full human being standing before the bench. The morning fog outside had begun to lift, and sunlight was starting to stream through the courtroom windows. For Sarah Martinez, locked away in a holding cell awaiting transport back to jail, it felt like the first ray of hope she had experienced in months. Someone had seen her, really seen her, and acknowledged the person she used to be. Whether that recognition would be enough to help her find her way back to that person remained to be seen. But for the first time in a very long time, she dared to hope that it might be possible. The Seattle County Jail's Records Department had seen many unusual requests over the years, but Lisa Rodriguez's inquiry about obtaining military service records for her client Sarah Martinez was generating quite a bit of attention. When the Public Defender's Office had contacted the Department of Defense to verify Sarah's claimed Navy SEAL status, the response had been immediate and definitive. Not only was Sarah Martinez a legitimate former Navy SEAL, but her service record was extraordinary even by the elite standards of that community. Lisa Rodriguez sat in her cramped office surrounded by stacks of case files and empty coffee cups, reviewing the documents that had arrived by secure courier that morning. Sarah's military personnel file was thick, filled with commendations, training certificates, and deployment records that painted the picture of an exemplary naval officer who had served with distinction in some of the most dangerous corners of the world. The file revealed that Sarah Lena Martinez had enlisted in the Navy at age 18, immediately after graduating from high school in her hometown of San Antonio, Texas. Her initial aptitude tests had scored in the top 5%, and her physical fitness evaluations were exceptional. After completing basic training with honors, she had been selected for advanced training programs that eventually led to her acceptance into the grueling Navy SEAL training program. Of the 200 candidates who had started SEAL training with Sarah's class, only 23 had successfully completed the program. Sarah had not only finished, but had graduated in the top 10% of her class, earning recognition for both her physical performance and her leadership abilities. The training record showed someone who had pushed herself beyond normal human limits and had excelled in situations designed to break down all but the most resilient individuals. Lisa turned the page to find Sarah's first assignment records. Fresh out of SEAL training, she had been assigned to SEAL Team 7, based in Coronado, California. Her initial evaluations from commanding officers described her as exceptionally dedicated, highly skilled in combat operations, and a natural leader with excellent judgment under pressure. These were not descriptions that matched the defeated woman Lisa had met in the courthouse just days earlier. The deployment records told the story of a military career spent in the world's most dangerous locations. Sarah had completed multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq during the height of combat operations there. She had participated in high-risk missions including direct action raids, reconnaissance operations, and counterterrorism activities that required the highest levels of skill and courage. One particular commendation caught Lisa's attention. During a mission in Afghanistan in 2018, Sarah's unit had been ambushed while conducting a night raid on a suspected terrorist compound. When their extraction helicopter was damaged by enemy fire and forced to make an emergency landing, Sarah had single-handedly held off attacking forces while evacuating wounded team members to safety. Her actions had saved the lives of 3 fellow SEALs and earned her the Bronze Star with V device for valor in combat. Lisa paused in her reading, trying to reconcile the hero described in these documents with the homeless woman who had been arrested for stealing bread and peanut butter. The disconnect was so profound that it was difficult to process. She continued reading, looking for clues about what might have led to such a dramatic change in Sarah's circumstances. The answers began to emerge in the later sections of the file. In 2019, during what was supposed to be Sarah's final deployment before transitioning to a training role stateside, her unit had been involved in a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. The details were heavily redacted, but the outcome was clear. Several members of Sarah's team had been killed in an improvised explosive device attack, including her closest friend and roommate, Petty Officer First Class Maria Santos. The incident report noted that Sarah had suffered a severe concussion and shrapnel wounds in the blast, but had remained conscious and continued to fight until reinforcements arrived. She had been awarded another combat medal for her actions during the attack, but the psychological impact of losing her teammates, particularly Maria Santos, had been devastating. Lisa found Sarah's medical records from her treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center following the Afghanistan incident. The physical injuries had healed relatively quickly, but the psychological evaluation painted a different picture. Sarah had been diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and traumatic brain injury symptoms, including memory problems and difficulty concentrating. Despite the diagnosis, Sarah had initially refused extended medical treatment or disability retirement. She had wanted to return to active duty, to get back to her team and continue serving. However, her medical evaluation board had determined that her injuries, particularly the traumatic brain injury, made her unsuitable for continued special operations duties. After 12 years of exemplary service, Sarah Martinez had been medically retired from the Navy in early 2020 with full honors and a disability rating. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. The medical records showed that Sarah had struggled with severe depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms that made it difficult for her to function in normal social situations. She had been prescribed medications for her conditions and had been enrolled in various veteran support programs, but nothing had seemed to help her adjust to life outside the military structure that had defined her identity for over a decade. Lisa found records showing that Sarah had initially tried to find work in private security, leveraging her military experience and training. She had been hired by a defense contracting firm and had worked for several months providing security services for government facilities. However, her PTSD symptoms had gradually worsened, and she had begun having panic attacks and flashbacks that interfered with her ability to perform her duties. The breaking point had come in late 2021 when Sarah had been involved in a minor car accident. The sound of the collision had triggered a severe flashback to the IED attack in Afghanistan, and she had been found by police officers sitting in her damaged vehicle, unresponsive and apparently reliving the combat experience. She had been hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation and had lost her security job due to extended absence. From that point, Sarah's life had spiraled downward with frightening speed. Without steady income, she had been unable to keep up with her rent and had been evicted from her apartment. Her family relationships, already strained by her struggles with PTSD, had deteriorated further when she had become homeless. Her parents, well-meaning but unable to understand her condition, had tried to help, but had ultimately given up when Sarah's behavior became unpredictable and sometimes hostile. Lisa discovered that Sarah had been in and out of various veteran support programs over the past 2 years, but had never stayed with any program long enough to receive meaningful help. Her medical records showed missed appointments, discontinued medications, and a pattern of isolating herself from potential sources of support. The proud, disciplined Navy SEAL had become a woman who couldn't trust anyone, including herself. The most heartbreaking entries in the file were the VA hospital records from Sarah's multiple emergency room visits over the past year. She had been brought in several times for injuries sustained while living on the streets, for malnutrition, and for psychiatric crises that had required temporary hospitalization. Each time, social workers had tried to connect her with housing programs and mental health services, but Sarah had always left before completing intake processes or following through with treatment recommendations. Lisa set down the thick file and rubbed her eyes, feeling emotionally drained from reading about her client's dramatic fall from hero to homeless defendant. The story was a devastating indictment of how society treated its veterans, particularly those suffering from invisible wounds of war like PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Here was a woman who had literally risked her life for her country, who had saved the lives of fellow service members, and who had been decorated for extraordinary courage under fire. Yet she had been allowed to fall through every safety net that was supposedly in place to support veterans. A knock on her office door interrupted Lisa's thoughts. Her paralegal, James Wilson, stuck his head into the office. "Lisa, there's someone here to see you about the Sarah Martinez case. Says he's from the Navy." Lisa looked up in surprise. "The Navy? What does the Navy want with a municipal court case?" "He says his name is Command Master Chief Robert Torres, and he's from the Naval Special Warfare Command. He says he served with Martinez and wants to help." Lisa had not been expecting military involvement in the case, but she was curious about what this Master Chief might be able to tell her about Sarah's background and circumstances. "Send him in," she said, quickly gathering the scattered documents from Sarah's file. Master Chief Torres was an imposing man in his late 40s, wearing his navy dress blue uniform with an array of ribbons and decorations that spoke to a distinguished military career. His bearing was unmistakably military, straight posture, confident stride, and alert eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Lisa's cluttered office. Despite his formal appearance, there was something warm and concerned in his expression as he introduced himself. "Rodriguez, thank you for seeing me," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Command Master Chief Robert Torres from Naval Special Warfare Command. I understand you're representing Petty Officer Martinez." "She's actually no longer in the Navy," Lisa corrected. "She was medically retired in 2020. "Ma'am, with respect, once a SEAL, always a SEAL," Torres replied firmly. "We don't abandon our people, regardless of their current status. When we heard that one of our own was in legal trouble, I was sent to see how the Navy could help." Lisa gestured for him to take a seat in the single chair facing her desk. "How did you even hear about Sarah's case? This is just a local municipal court matter." Torres looked uncomfortable for a moment. "Ma'am, the SEAL community is small, and we keep track of our people as best we can. When Martinez's name showed up in a news database search as a former SEAL facing criminal charges, it got flagged to our attention immediately. We've been trying to locate her for months to get her the help she needs." "You've been looking for her?" "Yes, ma'am. Martinez disappeared from all our support networks about a year ago. She stopped responding to outreach from her former teammates, stopped showing up for VA appointments, and basically went off the grid. We knew she was struggling with PTSD and other issues related to her service, but we didn't realize how badly things had deteriorated." Lisa leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "Tell me about Sarah before all this happened. What was she like as a SEAL?" Torres's expression brightened considerably. "Martinez was one of the finest operators I ever worked with, ma'am. She was tough as nails, absolutely fearless in combat, and had the respect of every person in her unit. She was also one of the most caring people you'd ever meet, always looking out for her teammates, always volunteering for the most dangerous missions to protect others. What happened during that last deployment?" "I've read the official reports, but they're heavily redacted." Torres was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much he could or should reveal. "Ma'am, what I can tell you is that Martinez and her team were conducting a high-priority mission when they were hit by a sophisticated IED attack. The explosion killed 3 SEALs instantly, including Martinez's best friend and swim buddy, Maria Santos. Martinez was severely injured but continued fighting to protect the survivors until help arrived. The reports mention that she saved lives during that attack." "She saved more than lives, ma'am. She saved the entire mission and prevented what could have been a complete catastrophe. But the cost to her personally was enormous. She blamed herself for not detecting the IED, for not being able to save her teammates, for surviving when others didn't. That kind of survivor guilt can destroy a person from the inside. Lisa nodded, beginning to understand the depth of Sarah's psychological trauma. Why didn't the Navy's support systems help her transition successfully to civilian life? Torres sighed deeply. Ma'am, that's a question that keeps a lot of us awake at night. The truth is, our support systems work well for some people, but for others, especially those with severe PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, the transition is incredibly difficult. Martinez was also incredibly proud and self-reliant. She didn't want to be seen as weak or broken, so she refused a lot of the help that was offered to her. And now she's homeless and facing criminal charges for stealing food. Yes, ma'am, and that's exactly why I'm here. The Navy doesn't abandon its people, and we're not going to abandon Martinez now. I've been authorized to offer whatever support is necessary to get her back on her feet. Housing, medical care, job training, whatever she needs. Lisa felt a surge of hope for her client. Having the Navy's support could make all the difference in Sarah's case and her future prospects. What specifically can you offer? We have residential treatment programs specifically for SEALs dealing with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. We can provide immediate housing, comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation, and a structured rehabilitation program designed specifically for special operations veterans. We also have job placement programs with defense contractors and other employers who understand the value of hiring former SEALs. And Sarah has agreed to this? Torres looked uncomfortable again. Well, ma'am, we haven't actually talked to Martinez yet. We were hoping you could help us make contact with her. We understand she's been very resistant to accepting help, but we're hoping that her current circumstances might make her more open to our assistance. Lisa realized that convincing Sarah to accept help from the Navy might be one of the biggest challenges in the case. Based on her file, Sarah had a pattern of refusing assistance and isolating herself from support systems. Getting her to trust anyone enough to accept comprehensive help would require careful handling. Master Chief, I appreciate the Navy's willingness to help, but I need to be honest with you. Sarah has been living on the streets for months, and she's developed a deep distrust of institutions and authority figures. She may not be receptive to military involvement in her case, even if it's meant to help her. I understand, ma'am, but I also know Martinez, and I know that underneath all the pain and trauma, she's still the same person who earned her SEAL trident through sheer determination and courage. We just need to find a way to reach that person and remind her that she's not alone. Lisa looked at the clock on her office wall and realized that visiting hours at the county jail would be ending soon. Would you be willing to come with me to meet with Sarah this afternoon? I think it might help if she sees that the Navy hasn't forgotten about her and that her former brothers-in-arms are willing to stand by her. Torres stood immediately. Ma'am, I would consider it an honor to speak with Petty Officer Martinez again. She's a true American hero, and it's time we treated her like one. As they prepared to leave for the jail, Lisa felt more optimistic about Sarah's case than she had since taking it on. The combination of Sarah's extraordinary service record, the Navy's willingness to provide comprehensive support, and the clear evidence that her crimes were the result of circumstances beyond her control, created a compelling argument for alternative sentencing that could address her underlying needs rather than simply punishing her for desperate acts. The drive to the county jail took them through some of Seattle's most challenging neighborhoods, areas where homelessness was visible on every street corner. Lisa found herself wondering how many of the people they passed had stories like Sarah's, tales of service and sacrifice that had been forgotten by a society that had moved on while they struggled with invisible wounds. At the jail, the process of arranging the meeting with Sarah took longer than expected. The facility's security protocols required special approval for visits from military personnel, and Torres had to provide extensive documentation of his identity and purpose. Finally, they were escorted to a small conference room where they would meet with Sarah. When Sarah entered the room, escorted by a corrections officer, the transformation from the woman Lisa had first met in court was striking. The prospect of facing someone from her military past seemed to have awakened something in her. She carried herself with more of the bearing that Torres had described, though her eyes still held the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Torres stood as she entered, and for a moment the two former SEALs simply looked at each other across the small room. Then Torres spoke, his voice filled with genuine emotion. Hello, Sarah. It's good to see you again. Sarah's carefully constructed defenses seemed to crumble at the sound of her former Master Chief's voice. For the first time since her arrest, Tears began to flow down her cheeks as she realized that someone from her old life had come to find her in her darkest hour. Sarah Martinez stared at Master Chief Torres across the small conference room table, struggling to process the reality of his presence. For over a year, she had convinced herself that her former life in the Navy was gone forever, that the person she had been as a SEAL was as dead as her teammates who had died in that Afghan explosion. Yet here was Torres, treating her with the same respect and concern he had shown during her active duty service, as if the months of homelessness and degradation hadn't stripped away her identity entirely. "Master Chief," Sarah said quietly, her voice hoarse with emotion, "I didn't expect to see anyone from the teams again." Torres leaned forward, his expression both compassionate and determined. "Sarah, we've been looking for you for months. When you disappeared from all our support networks, we knew something was seriously wrong. A SEAL doesn't just vanish unless they're in real trouble." Sarah looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. The orange jailed jumpsuit felt like a uniform of shame, marking her fall from the heights of military service to the depths of criminal defendant. "I'm not a SEAL anymore, Master Chief. I'm just another homeless person who got caught stealing food. You shouldn't waste your time on me." "Don't you dare say that!" Torres replied firmly, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military leadership. "You earned that trident through blood, sweat, and determination that most people can't even imagine. You've served in combat with distinction, saved American lives, and upheld the highest standards of the naval special warfare community. Nothing that's happened since changes any of that." Lisa Rodriguez watched the exchange with growing understanding of the unique bond between military personnel who had served together in combat. She could see that Torres represented more than just a former colleague to Sarah. He was a connection to a time when her life had meaning and purpose, when she had been valued and respected for her abilities and dedication. "Master Chief, you don't understand what I've become," Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I've been living in doorways and under bridges. I've eaten food out of garbage cans. I've done things just to survive that the person I used to be would never have done. I'm not the SEAL you remember." Torres was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle but unwavering. "Sarah, let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I see someone who survived 12 years of military service, including multiple combat deployments. I see someone who earned the Bronze Star for saving teammates under enemy fire. I see someone who has been fighting a different kind of war for the past 2 years, a war against PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and a society that doesn't understand what you've been through." He paused, making sure she was listening before continuing. "You're still fighting, Sarah. The fact that you're alive and sitting here talking to me means you haven't given up, even when everything seemed hopeless. That's not the behavior of someone who's given up. That's the behavior of a SEAL who refuses to quit, even when the odds are stacked against her." Sarah felt something stirring inside her that she hadn't experienced in months, a flicker of the person she used to be, the warrior who had never backed down from a challenge. But alongside that stirring came fear, the terror of hoping for something better only to have it taken away again. "What do you want from me, Master Chief?" she asked. "I want you to let us help you," Torres replied simply. "The Navy has residential treatment programs specifically designed for SEALs dealing with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. We have housing, medical care, psychological support, and job training programs. We have a whole network of people who understand what you've been through because they've been through it themselves." Sarah shook her head slowly. "I've tried VA programs before. They don't work for me. The counselors don't understand, the medications don't help, and the group therapy sessions just make me feel worse. I can't sit in a circle and talk about my feelings with strangers. This isn't the VA," Torres explained patiently. "These are programs run by and for special operations veterans. The counselors are former SEALs who've dealt with their own combat trauma. The group sessions are with people who've been exactly where you are. They understand what it's like to lose teammates, to feel responsible for things beyond your control, to struggle with the transition from being a warrior to being a civilian." Lisa Rodriguez decided it was time to contribute to the conversation. "Sarah, I've been reviewing your military records, and I have to tell you that your service record is extraordinary. The judge in your case has seen it too, and she's very interested in finding alternatives to traditional sentencing that would address your underlying needs rather than just punishing you for crimes that were clearly committed out of desperation. Sarah looked at her lawyer with surprise. "You've seen my records?" "Yes, and so has Judge Chen. She's postponed your sentencing specifically because she wants to explore options that would get you the help you need while recognizing your service to the country. But that's only possible if you're willing to accept help." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, wrestling with internal conflicts that had been tearing her apart for months. Part of her desperately wanted to accept the help being offered, to believe that there might be a way back from the darkness that had consumed her life. But another part of her, the part that had been disappointed and let down so many times, was afraid to hope. "What if I try and fail again?" she asked finally. "What if I can't handle the program? What if the PTSD and the brain injury symptoms are just too much? I can't go through another cycle of trying to get better and then falling apart again." Torres leaned back in his chair, considering his response carefully. "Sarah, do you remember SEAL training? Do you remember Hell Week?" Sarah nodded slightly. Hell Week was legendary in the military community. 5.5 days of continuous physical and mental challenges designed to break down all but the most determined candidates. "Do you remember what the instructors used to tell us when we thought we couldn't go on?" Torres continued. "Take it one evolution at a time," Sarah replied automatically, reciting the phrase that had been drilled into every SEAL candidate. "That's right. Don't worry about the whole week. Just focus on getting through the next hour. Don't think about the entire program. Just think about making it through today. You've already proven you can do impossible things when you break them down into manageable pieces." Sarah felt tears starting again as she remembered the young woman she had been during SEAL training. Determined, fearless, absolutely convinced that she could overcome any obstacle through sheer force of will. That person seemed like a stranger now, but Torres was suggesting that she might still exist somewhere underneath all the trauma and defeat. "The treatment program I'm talking about starts with a 30-day residential phase," Torres continued. "You don't have to commit to anything beyond that. Just 30 days in a safe environment with people who understand what you're going through. If it doesn't work, if you decide it's not right for you, then you can make a different choice. But at least give yourself that chance." Lisa Rodriguez could see that Sarah was wavering, caught between hope and fear. She decided to add some practical considerations that might help tip the balance. "Sarah, from a legal standpoint, participating in this program would be very beneficial for your case. Judge Chen is looking for alternatives to jail time that would address your underlying issues. Successful completion of a treatment program would likely result in the charges being dismissed or significantly reduced." "And if I don't complete the program?" Sarah asked. "Then you'd face traditional sentencing for the charges," Lisa admitted. "But honestly, given your service record and the circumstances of your case, I don't think any judge would impose harsh penalties even then. The worst-case scenario is probably community service and probation." Torres pulled out a folder he had been carrying and placed it on the table. "Sarah, I brought some information about the program, including testimonials from other SEALs who've been through it successfully. I also brought contact information for some of your former teammates who want to support you through this process." Sarah looked at the folder as if it might contain explosives. The idea of reconnecting with her former teammates was both appealing and terrifying. She had been so ashamed of what she had become that she had cut off all contact with anyone who had known her during her military service. "Maria Santos's family has been asking about you," Torres said gently, mentioning Sarah's best friend who had died in Afghanistan. The mention of Maria's name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Maria had been more than a teammate. She had been Sarah's closest friend, the person who had understood her better than anyone else in the world. The guilt Sarah felt about surviving when Maria didn't had been one of the driving forces behind her psychological breakdown. "They don't blame you for what happened, Sarah," Torres continued. "Maria's parents specifically asked me to tell you that they consider you part of their family, and they want to help you get through this. They've been worried sick about you since you disappeared." Sarah broke down completely at this revelation. For over 2 years, she had carried the crushing weight of believing that Maria's family must hate her for surviving when their daughter didn't. The thought that they actually cared about her well-being and wanted to help was almost too much to process. Through her tears, she managed to ask, "What would I have to do to get into this program?" Torres and Lisa Rodriguez exchanged a quick glance, both recognizing that this was the breakthrough they had been hoping for. "The first step is getting you released from jail so you can be evaluated for the program," Lisa explained. I can file a motion with the court requesting your release on your own recognizance pending sentencing, with participation in the treatment program as a condition. The Navy can provide transportation to the treatment facility and will guarantee your appearance at all future court dates, Torres added. We can also provide temporary housing if there's any delay in getting you into the residential program. Sarah wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her jumpsuit and tried to compose herself. For the first time in months, she was being offered a genuine chance at rebuilding her life, not just surviving from day to day. The prospect was both exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. I need to think about this, she said finally. Of course, Torres replied, but don't think too long. The longer you stay in survival mode, the harder it becomes to imagine any other way of living. You deserve better than what you've been settling for, Sarah. You've earned the right to get your life back. As the meeting concluded and Sarah was escorted back to her cell, she found herself thinking about Maria Santos for the first time in months without being overwhelmed by guilt and despair. Instead, she found herself wondering what Maria would want her to do in this situation. Maria had always been the optimistic one, the teammate who believed that any problem could be solved with enough determination and the right support. Back in her cell, Sarah lay on her narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine what it would be like to wake up in a place where people understood her experiences, where her struggles with PTSD were seen as injuries to be treated rather than weaknesses to be ashamed of. For the first time in over a year, she allowed herself to hope that recovery might be possible. The next morning, Lisa Rodriguez filed a motion with the court requesting Sarah's release pending sentencing, with participation in the Navy's treatment program as a condition. She included detailed documentation of the program, testimonials from other participants, and letters of support from Sarah's former teammates and commanding officers. Judge Chen reviewed the motion with great interest, and she had spent considerable time researching Navy SEAL training and service requirements, and had been appalled to learn about the high rates of PTSD and suicide among Special Operations veterans. Sarah Martinez's case had opened her eyes to the failures of civilian support systems for military personnel transitioning from the most elite and dangerous military roles to civilian life. The prosecutor, David Warner, had also spent time researching veteran issues since Sarah's initial court appearance. He had consulted with his office's veteran liaison and had concluded that prosecution of Sarah Martinez for desperate acts committed while suffering from service-related disabilities would not serve any legitimate law enforcement purpose. When the motion hearing was scheduled for the following week, word had somehow spread through the local veteran community about Sarah's case. Judge Chen was surprised to find her courtroom packed with spectators, many of them veterans wearing military insignia and patches identifying their service branches and units. Master Chief Torres sat in the front row along with two other men in Navy dress uniforms whom Lisa Rodriguez recognized from the photographs in Sarah's military file as former teammates. The sight of these decorated military personnel showing up to support a homeless defendant had created quite a stir in the courthouse. As Sarah was brought into the courtroom, she was shocked to see the crowd of supporters. She had become so accustomed to being invisible, to having no one care about her fate, that the presence of so many people was overwhelming. When she spotted Torres and her former teammates, she felt a surge of emotion that threatened to bring her to tears again. Judge Chen called the case and quickly reviewed the motion for release and the supporting documentation. She had never seen such an extensive collection of character references and support offers for any defendant in her courtroom. The Navy's treatment program appeared to be exactly what Sarah needed, and the level of institutional support being offered was unprecedented in her experience. Ms. Martinez, Judge Chen said, addressing Sarah directly, I've reviewed your attorney's motion and the supporting documentation. I've also had an opportunity to speak with representatives from the Navy's treatment program, and I'm impressed by what they're offering. However, I need to hear from you directly. Are you prepared to commit to this program? Sarah stood at attention, her posture reflecting the military bearing that had been trained into her during 12 years of service. For the first time since her arrest, she felt like she was being treated as a person, rather than just another criminal defendant. Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice clear and strong. I'm ready to accept help and work toward getting my life back together. Judge Chen nodded approvingly. Then I'm granting the motion for release. Martinez, you are hereby released on your own recognizance pending sentencing, with the condition that you report immediately to the Navy treatment facility and comply with all program requirements. Your sentencing hearing is continued pending your completion of the initial 3-0 Day evaluation period. As Sarah was released from custody and walked out of the courthouse with Master Chief Torres and her legal team, she felt like she was taking the first steps on a journey back to the person she used to be. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges that would test every bit of her determination and courage. But for the first time in over 2 years, she was no longer facing those challenges alone. The Warrior Recovery Center sat on 50 acres of wooded hills about an hour outside Seattle, its location chosen specifically to provide peace and isolation for military personnel struggling with combat-related psychological injuries. As Master Chief Torres's vehicle wound up the gravel drive toward the main building, Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the passenger window, taking in her first glimpse of what might become her new temporary home. The facility looked more like a retreat center than a medical facility, with rustic wooden buildings connected by covered walkways and surrounded by towering Douglas fir trees. Sarah could see people in casual clothing walking along marked trails, some alone and some in small groups. There was something different about their bearing that marked them as military even in civilian clothes. A certain alertness and way of moving that never fully disappeared even years after leaving service. This place was started by a former SEAL who went through his own struggle with PTSD after losing most of his unit in Iraq, Torres explained as they approached the main building. Commander Jake Morrison realized that traditional treatment programs weren't working for special operations veterans because they didn't understand the unique aspects of our training and experience. Sarah nodded but remained quiet, feeling a mixture of hope and anxiety about what lay ahead. The past week since her release from jail had been a whirlwind of medical evaluations, paperwork, and meetings with program staff. Everyone had been supportive and understanding, but she had learned to be cautious about placing too much faith in any system or program. The intake process at Warrior Recovery Center was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in civilian treatment programs. Instead of sitting across a desk from a counselor with a clipboard, she found herself in a comfortable living room setting with Dr. Correa. Amanda Richardson, a former Army psychologist who had served in combat zones herself, and Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan, a retired Navy SEAL who now worked as a peer counselor. Sarah, we've reviewed your military records and your recent experiences, Dr. Richardson began, her tone professional but warm. What we want you to understand from the beginning is that everything you've been through, the combat trauma, the survivor guilt, the struggles with civilian transition, even the homelessness, are all normal responses to abnormal experiences. There's nothing wrong with you that can't be addressed with the right support and treatment. Chief Sullivan leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but compassionate. Sarah, I lost 3 teammates in a training accident. 8 years ago. I spent 2 years after that drinking myself to death and pushing away everyone who tried to help me. I ended up living in my car for 6 months before someone from my old unit tracked me down and dragged me into treatment. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that everyone here understands what rock bottom looks like, and we know it's possible to climb back up. For the first time since arriving, Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. These weren't civilian therapists trying to understand experiences they had never faced. These were people who had walked similar paths and found their way back to productive lives. The program structure was intensive, but carefully designed to work with the military mindset rather than against it. Instead of traditional group therapy sessions, participants engaged in after-action reviews, where they analyzed their experiences using the same systematic approach they had used to debrief military operations. Instead of individual counseling sessions that felt like interrogations, participants worked one-on-one with peer mentors who had faced similar challenges. Sarah's daily routine began at 0600 with physical training, not the punishing military PT she remembered, but carefully designed exercises intended to help participants reconnect with their bodies and rebuild confidence in their physical capabilities. The trauma of combat and the degradation of homelessness had left Sarah feeling disconnected from her body, uncertain of her physical abilities and deeply distrustful of her own instincts. Physical fitness isn't just about strength and endurance, explained Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a former Marine who led the PT sessions. For people with PTSD and traumatic brain injury, regular exercise helps regulate brain chemistry, improves sleep patterns, and restores the sense of physical competence that trauma takes away. After the first week of morning PT sessions, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in how she felt. Her sleep, which had been fragmented and filled with nightmares for over 2 years, began to improve, The constant hypervigilance that had exhausted her while living on the streets started to diminish in the secure environment of the center. The afternoons were dedicated to individual and group work addressing the psychological aspects of recovery. Sarah's individual sessions were with Dr. Trans Richardson, who specialized in combat trauma and understood the unique aspects of special operations culture. Unlike previous therapists who had tried to get Sarah to open up about her feelings, Dr. Richardson approached her psychological injuries with the same systematic methodology that Sarah had been trained to apply to military problems. Let's start by establishing the facts of what happened during your last deployment, Dr. Precaf would say. Richardson suggested during their third session, "We're not trying to process emotions right now. We're just trying to get a clear picture of the events that led to your current symptoms." This approach felt familiar and manageable to Sarah. She could discuss the tactical details of the mission, the sequence of events during the IED attack, and the immediate aftermath without feeling overwhelmed by emotions. Only after they had established a clear factual foundation did Dr. Richardson begin to explore Sarah's emotional responses to those events. "You've mentioned several times that you feel responsible for not detecting the IED that killed your teammates, Dr. Say-so," Richardson observed. "Let's examine that belief from a tactical perspective. Based on your training and experience, what factors determine whether an IED can be detected before detonation?" Sarah found herself analyzing her feelings of guilt with the same objective methodology she had once applied to mission planning. When she examined her sense of responsibility through the lens of tactical analysis rather than emotional self-blame, she began to see that her guilt was based on impossible expectations rather than reasonable standards. The group sessions were perhaps the most powerful aspect of the program. Sarah found herself in a room with 8 other special operations veterans, each dealing with their own version of combat trauma and transition difficulties. There was Tom, a former Delta Force operator, who had struggled with alcohol abuse after losing his left leg in Syria. There was Jennifer, a former Air Force pararescue specialist who had developed severe depression after a mission where she couldn't save a wounded pilot. There was Carlos, a former Marine raider who had been living in his truck for 18 months after his marriage fell apart due to his PTSD symptoms. The thing about being in special operations is that we're trained to be self-reliant, to solve problems independently, and to never show weakness, explained Chief Sullivan during one group session. Those are valuable traits in combat, but they can become liabilities in civilian life, especially when dealing with psychological injuries that require accepting help from others. Sarah found that listening to her fellow veterans describe their struggles helped her understand her own experiences in new ways. When Tom talked about the shame he felt about becoming homeless despite his military achievements, Sarah recognized her own feelings reflected in his words. When Jennifer described the survivor guilt that consumed her thoughts, Sarah felt less alone in her own struggles with having survived when Maria Santos didn't. The program also included practical life skills training designed to help participants transition successfully to civilian life. Sarah worked with a job counselor to explore career options that would utilize her military skills while accommodating her PTSD symptoms. She learned budgeting and money management skills that she had never needed during her military service. She practiced social skills for civilian interactions that felt foreign after years of military culture. One of the most challenging aspects of the program was family reconciliation work. Sarah had cut off contact with her parents and siblings when her life began falling apart, partly out of shame and partly to protect them from her increasingly erratic behavior. The program included family therapy sessions designed to help participants rebuild relationships that had been damaged by their struggles. "Your family has been worried about you for over 2 years," explained Dr. Richardson after Sarah's first phone call with her parents in 18 months. "They didn't abandon you because they didn't care. They stepped back because they didn't know how to help and were afraid of making things worse." The conversation with her parents had been emotional and difficult, filled with tears, apologies, and tentative expressions of hope for the future. Her father, a retired construction worker who had never fully understood his daughter's military service, struggled to find words to express his pride in her accomplishments and his sorrow over her suffering. Her mother simply kept repeating how much she loved Sarah and how glad she was that she was getting help. As Sarah progressed through the program, she began to rediscover aspects of her personality that had been buried under layers of trauma and survival instincts. Her natural leadership abilities emerged during group activities. Her dry sense of humor, which had been completely absent during her months of homelessness, began to resurface during interactions with other participants. 3 weeks into the program, Sarah received a visit that would prove to be a turning point in her recovery. Maria Santos's parents, Elena and Roberto Santos, had driven up from California to see her. Sarah had been dreading this meeting since learning that they wanted to visit, convinced that seeing them would reopen all the wounds of guilt and grief that she had been working to heal. Elena Santos was a small, dignified woman in her 60s who embraced Sarah the moment they met, tears streaming down both their faces. "Mija," she said, using the Spanish term of endearment that Maria had often used for Sarah, "we have been so worried about you. Maria loved you like a sister, and that makes you family to us." Roberto Santos, a reserved man who had served in Vietnam, struggled with his own emotions as he spoke to Sarah. "Maria wrote to us about you all the time," he said. "She told us how you looked out for all the younger SEALs, how you always volunteered for the most dangerous missions to protect your teammates. She was so proud to serve with you." The conversation that followed was one of the most healing experiences of Sarah's life. The Santos family didn't blame her for surviving when their daughter didn't. Instead, they saw her as a living connection to their daughter's memory, and a person whose continued existence honored Maria's sacrifice. "Maria would be heartbroken to know that you've been suffering like this," Elena said firmly. "She would want you to get better, to use your skills and experience to help other people, to live the life that she can't live anymore." By the end of the 30-day evaluation period, Sarah had made remarkable progress. Her PTSD symptoms hadn't disappeared, but she had developed coping strategies that allowed her to manage them without being overwhelmed. Her depression had lifted enough that she could imagine a future beyond mere survival. Most importantly, she had reconnected with the sense of purpose and identity that had defined her during her military service. Dr. Kirk Richardson's evaluation report described Sarah as an excellent candidate for the extended treatment program, with strong motivation for recovery and good response to the interventions provided during the evaluation period. She recommended that Sarah continue with the program for an additional 60 days, followed by a structured transition to independent living with ongoing support. As Sarah prepared for the court hearing that would determine her legal fate, she felt more confident and hopeful than she had in over 2 years. She wasn't the same person who had entered the program a month earlier. She was beginning to rediscover the warrior she had always been, not just in combat, but in facing the challenges of recovery and rebuilding her life. The night before her court appearance, Sarah sat on the deck of her residence hall, looking up at stars that were visible despite the lights of Seattle in the distance. For the first time since that terrible day in Afghanistan when her world had exploded along with that IED, she felt like she had a future worth fighting for. Master Chief Torres found her there, enjoying his own quiet moment after a day of meetings at the center. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" he asked, settling into a chair beside her. "Nervous," Sarah admitted, "for example, but also hopeful. A month ago, I couldn't imagine anything beyond getting through each day. Now I'm starting to think about what I want to do with the rest of my life." Torres smiled, recognizing the spark in her voice that had been missing for so long. The Sarah Martinez I remember always had big plans and the determination to make them happen. It's good to see that person coming back. Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of his words. She was coming back, not as the same person she had been before Afghanistan, but as someone stronger and wiser for having survived experiences that had broken many others. Tomorrow's court appearance would determine the legal resolution of her case, but she already knew that the most important battle, the fight for her own life and future, was being won. The Seattle Municipal Courthouse was buzzing with unusual activity on the morning of Sarah Martinez's sentencing hearing. Word had spread through military and veteran networks about the case of the former Navy SEAL who had been homeless and was now fighting her way back to recovery. The courtroom was packed with supporters, media representatives, and curious observers who had come to witness what many were calling a test case for how the justice system should handle veteran defendants struggling with service-related disabilities. Judge Margaret Chen arrived early that morning, having spent considerable time over the past month researching similar cases and consulting with veteran affairs experts. Sarah Martinez's case had already changed how she thought about the intersection of military service, mental health, and criminal justice. More importantly, it had reinforced her belief that the purpose of the court should be to solve problems and heal communities, not simply to punish wrongdoing. Sarah entered the courtroom flanked by her attorney Lisa Rodriguez and Master Chief Torres, looking dramatically different from the defeated woman who had first appeared before Judge Chen 6 weeks earlier. She wore a simple but professional blue dress donated by one of the program volunteers, and her hair had been cut and styled in a way that emphasized her natural dignity. Most significantly, she carried herself with the bearing of a professional military officer. Shoulders back, chin up, alert and engaged with her surroundings. The transformation was so complete that several court personnel did double takes, struggling to reconcile this poised, confident woman with the homeless defendant they remembered from the initial hearing. Deputy Johnson, the bailiff who had seen thousands of defendants over his career, later told his colleagues that he had never witnessed such a dramatic change in a defendant's appearance and demeanor over such a short period. As Judge Chen called the court to order, she noticed the diverse crowd of spectators. In addition to the military personnel she had expected, there were representatives from veteran service organizations, social workers, other former Navy SEALs, and members of the Santos family who had driven up from California to show their support for Sarah. The media presence was also significant, with reporters from local television stations and newspapers covering the case as an example of innovative approaches to veteran justice issues. Before we proceed with sentencing, Judge Chen began, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances of this case and the remarkable progress that Mrs. Genaro Martinez has made over the past month. This court has received detailed reports from the Warrior Recovery Center, documenting her participation in their program and her significant improvement in addressing the underlying issues that contributed to the charges she faces today. The prosecutor, David Warner, stood to address the court. Over the past month, his office had received numerous communications from veteran organizations, military officials, and community members advocating for Sarah. He had also conducted his own research into best practices for handling cases involving veteran defendants with service-related disabilities. Your Honor, Warner said, the state has carefully reviewed all the materials related to Ms. Martinez's military service, her current treatment program, and the circumstances that led to these charges. Given her extraordinary record of service to our country, her complete cooperation with the court-ordered treatment program, and the minimal nature of the offenses, the state is prepared to recommend dismissal of all charges upon successful completion of Ms. Martinez's treatment program. A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. This outcome was better than even the most optimistic observers had hoped for, representing not just mercy but a recognition that traditional criminal penalties would serve no legitimate purpose in this case. Judge Chen nodded approvingly at the prosecutor's recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Warner. Ms. Rodriguez, does your client have anything she would like to say to the court? Lisa Rodriguez stood and gestured for Sarah to approach the podium. This was the moment everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for. The opportunity to hear directly from the former Navy SEAL whose journey from hero to homeless defendant to recovering veteran had captured so much attention. Sarah walked to the podium with confident steps, her military bearing evident in every movement. When she reached the microphone, she paused for a moment to compose her thoughts, looking out at the packed courtroom before addressing Judge Chen directly. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. 5 weeks ago, I stood in this courtroom as a broken woman who had lost everything that ever mattered to her. I had lost my identity as a SEAL, my sense of purpose, my connection to family and friends, and ultimately my faith in myself and in the possibility that my life could ever have meaning again. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. The charges I faced were accurate. I did steal food and I was trespassing. I did these things not because I'm a criminal, but because I was a combat veteran who had fallen through every safety net that was supposed to catch people like me. I was suffering from invisible wounds that were just as real and debilitating as any physical injury I might have sustained in combat. Judge Chen listened intently, struck by the articulate and thoughtful way Sarah was expressing herself. This was clearly a highly intelligent and capable person, who had been failed by systems that should have provided better support for her transition to civilian life. What I've learned over the past month, Sarah continued, is that my struggles with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and survivor guilt don't define me as a person, but they are injuries that require treatment and ongoing management, just like any other war wound. I've also learned that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom, and a necessary step toward becoming useful to my community again. Sarah turned slightly to acknowledge the crowd of supporters behind her. I've been overwhelmed by the support I've received from my former teammates, from the Santos family who lost their daughter Maria in the same attack where I was injured, from my own family, and from complete strangers who heard my story and decided to help. This support has reminded me that I'm not alone in my struggles, and that there are people who believe I can contribute something positive to the world. She faced Judge Chen again, her expression serious and determined. Your Honor, I want to assure this court that I understand the gravity of what brought me here, and I'm committed to completing my treatment and rebuilding my life in a way that honors the opportunities I'm being given. I also want to use my experience to help other veterans who might be struggling with similar issues, so that hopefully fewer people will have to go through what I've gone through. Judge Chen felt moved by Sarah's words and by the obvious sincerity of her commitment to recovery. Ms. Martinez, I want to thank you for your service to our country and for your honesty with this court about your struggles and your recovery. Your case has been educational for everyone involved in our justice system about the unique challenges facing military veterans, particularly those who have served in combat roles. The judge paused to review her notes before continuing. I'm accepting the state's recommendation for dismissal of all charges upon successful completion of your treatment program. However, I'm also going beyond that recommendation to formally commend you for your military service and for the courage you've shown in facing your personal challenges and seeking the help you need to overcome them. The courtroom erupted in applause, with many of the military personnel in attendance coming to their feet to honor Sarah. Judge Chen allowed the demonstration to continue for several moments before calling for quiet. Ms. Martinez, the judge continued, this court would like to present you with a certificate of appreciation recognizing both your military service and your efforts to overcome the challenges you've faced in transitioning to civilian life. We hope this will serve as a reminder that your service and sacrifice are valued by your community, and that your recovery and future contributions are important to all of us. As Sarah accepted the certificate, tears flowed freely down her cheeks. The document was symbolic rather than legal, but it represented something she had feared was lost forever. Recognition of her worth as a person and acknowledgement that her service had meaning. Master Chief Torres stood in the gallery, his own eyes moist with emotion as he watched his former subordinate receive the recognition she deserved. He had seen many SEALs struggle with the transition to civilian life, but few had fallen as far as Sarah or fought their way back with such determination. After the formal proceedings concluded, Sarah was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Elena Santos embraced her, whispering in her ear, Maria would be so proud of you today. Roberto Santos shook her hand with the firm grip of one veteran acknowledging another. Representatives from veteran service organizations approached Sarah to discuss opportunities for her to become involved in peer support and advocacy work. Her story had already begun to inspire changes in how military and civilian support systems approached veterans with combat-related psychological injuries. Dr. Richardson from the Warrior Recovery Center was present to witness Sarah's court appearance and was struck by the poise and confidence she displayed. This is what recovery looks like, she told a reporter after the hearing. It's not about returning to some previous state of being. It's about integrating your experiences, managing your symptoms, and finding new purpose and meaning in your life. 3 months after her court appearance, Sarah Martinez had completed the extended treatment program at Warrior Recovery Center and had transitioned to independent living in a veteran housing program in Seattle. She had found employment with a nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless veterans, using her own experience to help others navigate the complex systems of support that were available to them. Her work was challenging but deeply fulfilling. Every day she encountered veterans whose stories echoed her own. People who had served their country with distinction but had struggled with the transition to civilian life, often ending up homeless, addicted, or involved with the criminal justice system. Her credibility with these individuals was immediate and powerful. They could see in her bearing and hear in her words that she had walked the same difficult path they were traveling. The difference between me and a lot of the veterans I work with now, Sarah told a group of law enforcement officers during a training session on veteran issues, isn't that I was stronger or more deserving of help. The difference is that I was lucky enough to encounter people in the system who recognized that my behavior was a symptom of untreated injuries rather than evidence of moral failing. I was given opportunities for treatment and support that many veterans never receive. Sarah's case had begun to influence policy discussions at both local and national levels. Judge Chen had written an article for a legal journal describing the case and advocating for specialized veteran courts that would be better equipped to address the unique needs of military defendants. The article had been widely circulated and had contributed to growing interest in veteran justice initiatives across the country. The Warrior Recovery Center had used Sarah's case as an example of their program's effectiveness when applying for. A homeless woman faced trial. Then the court learned she was a SEAL.